Man, what's up, y'all? It has been a hot minute. It's been a very, very hot minute. And if you are in Memphis, it has been even hotter. I think the heat index for today is 107. So we have missed you guys. Ryan is not able to be here today, and we have not recorded in about a month and a half, maybe even longer. I truly don't know because I've enjoyed it. Not even going to lie to y'all. But, man, it's great having y'all back on. It's great being back with y'all. And thanks for y'all who've asked questions. We've just been busy, man. I'm not even going to lie. So this will actually serve as the season finale. But before we get into that, I want to give a quick shout out. Shout out to my guy John O in Atlanta. My wife Joy and I just got back from Atlanta, and we visited his church over the weekend, and we actually heard Trip Lee preach. So that was dope as well. Shout out to John O for just giving us information and also giving us dinner brunch recommendations as well. It was dope. The Real Milk and Honey. If you are in Atlanta, go to the Real Milk and Honey. It is everything that it sounds like. I promise you that much. But today on the podcast, man, we got a very special guest. This guy has been on the podcast before, and he actually asked to come on again to promote his book when it was done. I think at the time that the previous episode was recorded, it was a year from when the book came out, and now the book is out. At the time of recording the podcast, he was in Memphis, and now he is in Charlottesville, Virginia, leaving my church, doing us wrong. I'm kidding. But I'm talking about my guy, Claude Atcho. What's good, man?
Darius, good to be with you, bro. Thank you for that generous welcome. Appreciate it, man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. So it's 107 here in Memphis. What is it like in Virginia? Because I feel like it's not 107.
It's not. Charlottesville, it's actually it just started raining a little bit, drizzling, but it still gets a little humid. It's probably like 75, 80, something like that. The weather's crazy here. It just flips every other day, it feels like.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And I follow you on Twitter, so I saw your tweet. You said you're playing basketball for the first time in I think 2 years. You said you've been stretching for 2 days.
I've been stretching for 48 hours. Yeah, tonight is my return to the to organized hoops, the men's YMCA Rec League basketball 4v4. Watch out, mid-range jumpers going to be flying all over the place. So that's my plan for tonight.
Yeah, just make sure you go with a duffel bag. That's my recommendation. Just always go in with a duffel bag, and people will never doubt your talent.
That's right.
Going into it. So go in with a duffel bag, and they will surely guard you in a way that's respectful. So you've watched the NBA Finals, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Were you surprised? Is that about what you expected?
It's about what I expected. Yeah, I'm the one sports team I do root for, the Celtics. Just having lived in that area 2 times for formative periods of my life, so I do love the Celtics. Hard to root against Steph and Clay. I love them as well. So I was sad, disappointed, but not surprised.
Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're a KD guy. Is that right?
I do like KD a lot. Yes. Yep.
Yeah, you like KD a lot. As a matter of fact, you put me on his podcast. I didn't even listen to it before you recommended it. So, speaking of KD, like, what do you think this kind of does for his legacy? Because now they've won with Harrison Barnes and Andrew Wiggins, pre and post KD.
Yeah, to me, KD is he's just a great all-time talent, great player, one of the best scorers we've ever seen. So to me, it doesn't really do anything to his legacy. It just further cements how great Steph is. And KD is great in his own right. That 2017 team with him on the Warriors is just one of the best teams of all time. So, to me, it doesn't take anything away from Steph, or excuse me, rather from KD. It just solidifies, the greatness of Curry.
Yeah, and I feel like truly, and I promise y'all, we're going to get into the book. We are going to get into the book. But I promise, I feel like over the past 6, maybe even 8 years, like Steph Curry's caught a lot of strays and whatnot, where it's like, oh, he's only done this because he's got this talent. He only did this because KD was on the team. Before that, it was like he only did it because his team was so talented. So I'm glad that he finally has like that on his resume, an undeniable championship that he clearly carried them.
I agree.
So, but as a Grizzly fan, like that's where my Warrior support ends. Because they've been wilding on social media. I'm like, come on, man, what are we doing here?
The Golden State Memphis games next year will be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I got season tickets, so I'm just trying to figure out if I'm going to sell those tickets for max dollar or am I going to go. I don't know yet.
It's tough choice.
2 games.
Tough choice.
It's at least it's at least 2 games. I'm excited. I know that much. But we are not here to talk about the Grizzlies. We are not here to talk about the Celtics. We are here to talk about your book. Reading Black Books, How African American Literature Can Make Our Faith More Whole and Just. Talk to me about the title.
Yes, so, what the title, So when you're writing with institutions or publishers, you're usually not picking the title. The editors and different teams are usually working with. They're making that final decision. You may have some input. So I had most input around the subtitle, how African American literature can make our faith more whole and just. It's a little bit of a play and reference to Frederick Douglass. At the end of his kind of narrative autobiography, he has this appendix where he talks about the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land, meaning America. And he makes a distinction between slaveholders who had their sort of brand of Christianity and what he understood and saw as the sort of pure faith Christianity proper from the scriptures. And he talks about, in his contrast between those two expressions of the faith, he talks about one as being corrupt and impartial, and the other as being kind of like whole and proper. And so that's sort of what I wanted to allude to with the title. And really what that's getting at is the fact that when we look at African American literature through a literary lens, but also reflecting on it as Christians, some of the difficult questions, the important themes, the sort of reflection that's happening in our seminal literature can actually lead us into the type of faith that Douglass talks about, which is a more robust, more full, and ultimately more biblical discipleship to Jesus. And so that's what the subtitle is getting at, the formative power of this literature.
Yeah, and you talk about it in the book, but like, you've been a pastor, you've worked at universities, you've done lots of reading, and just you're a student of literature, I would call you, to some capacity. What led to you wanting to write this book, and like what led to you actually like getting the confidence to actually do it?
So, a lot of these stories that and novels that I cover in the book are novels and stories that have meant a lot to me as a reader, encountering them, in undergrad, grad school, or just on my own later. And I have always loved this literature. And then I've always sort of struggled as to how to relate to it in terms of my discipleship and in terms of my faith as a Christian. I'd always had wanted a book like the one that I wrote, which would sort of engage with the novel on its own terms, but then also bridge the gap into some Christian reflection, like, hey, what does this mean for me as a disciple of Jesus? Because I would read these stories, and like any good stories, there's so many deep resonances with life in the world, which obviously is connected to the commands of Jesus, being a disciple, how you deal with suffering, how you deal with injustice, all these sort of things, how you can have hope in the midst of being hard pressed, right? That's a human theme. That's also a biblical theme. And so I always felt myself reading these stories and kind of wanting to have these conversations that would engage with the story in terms of the literature, like you would in English class. But then I wanted it to be brought into the church, like the discussion you might have in a Sunday school. And so I've always wanted to kind of bring those together. And so that was really the genesis for the book for me. And there are a couple of writers who have started doing this. One writer is Karen Swallow Prior. She wrote a book called On Reading Well, which does what I'm trying to do in reading Black books, though Karen's book is, Victorian literature, British literature, and some contemporary literature. I saw that book and said, this is brilliantly conceived, well written, and really formative. And then I thought to myself, somebody ought to do this for African American literature. When the pandemic hit, I found myself at home with my family and was fortunate enough to have my needs met where I could be at home, and then I just had a little space to write, so I started working on the project then.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think kind of what you talked about in the book, and I believe that you called it reading theologically, reading from a theological perspective, which we'll get to in 1 minute. I am curious though, because like they say that like when going to like get ready to write a book, then you typically need about like, let's say 10,000 Twitter followers, active on social media, so on and so forth, have a large social media presence. No disrespect, but I don't feel like that like you are active on social media in comparison to maybe other people who have written books and whatnot. Yeah. So like, how'd you kind of like get through that hurdle?
Yeah, that's no disrespect. That's a great compliment to me. I mean, I really don't enjoy social media in large quantity the way I see others engage with it. And that's just me. I think to me, it's a dip in, dip out. So I try to come in on Twitter, find one good thing, and then bounce. And the things that I want to do and accomplish in life means that I can't be on social media a ton. And so, if I want to be creative, I want to write, want to be present. I can't do that all the time. Others, it may be different, but for me, that's just kind of how I approach things. So you're right, though. That's what's ironic, where like if you want to do creative things, you want to make art, write, build companies, whatever, run basketball camp, coach, do these sort of things. You can't be plugged in online all the time, but you sort of have to be visible online in order to get some of these opportunities. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So all that to say, that was probably the biggest hurdle for me in terms of getting a publishing opportunity was the sort of platform question. However, I was fortunate that the concept was strong enough. My writing apparently was strong enough, and I had a couple kind of key people in key places that vouched for my work, and that helps me not just get my foot in the door, but sort of verified for the publisher, like, hey, this is an important project and it's viable, right? Companies they want to they're a business, they need to make their profits, and so that helped me. So I would say for people who are maybe thinking about trying to do some of this work and they don't have that platform, as long as if you're writing and your craft is strong, like you will find a way.
Yeah, no, that's good. And you mentioned Karen Swallow Pryor, who's a great Twitter follow, by the way. Like,
she is,
she's a great Twitter follow. Was she kind of like one of your mentors, or would you even call her that, or just an advisee in writing this book?
I would say I have a lot of mentors that I've never met in person. There are people that may not know me, but I learned from them. So in that sense, yes. And then she was very generous. We just had a brief correspondence online. Had a couple mutual people that we have known, and so I think that gave me a little credibility, and she was kind to kind of open a couple doors for me.
Yeah, cool. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the book. You talked about like reading theologically. I think that's like something that can easily be heard and even easily be understood, but it's not said as much. And I think that like right now we're dealing with a time. I'm an educator, by the way, for those who don't know. I'm a school counselor. So you're dealing with education in a time where a lot of places are banning books from the perspective of like maybe they're not reading these things theologically, even though they claim a theological adherence. Do you feel like it's ironic that your book kind of came out at like the same time that some of this is going on?
Yeah, I do, because I think part of, I conceived this project in March 2022, like properly. I think it had been in me before that, but that's when I explicitly said, hey, I want to try to do this project. And at that time, you remember, killing of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd a couple months later. So there was this upswell of interest.
Real quick. You said March 2022.
Sorry, March 2020. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
March 2020. Thanks for catching that. So if you recall, there's this upswell in interest of, everyone was posting the black squares, right? Everyone was kind of like, hey, we got to do something about racial injustice, and so there's this strong interest in, I think, people wanting, hey, we need books by black authors, all this sort of stuff. And then cycle forward 2 years, now we're kind of seeing this reaction of sort of the removal of some of these books, including one of the books that I touch on, which is Toni Morrison's Beloved. Not touch on, devote a whole chapter to, rather. So I do find it, ironic in that sense, but I also find it, timely in God's providence that, hopefully I can offer folks that might say, hey, this is a hard book, maybe we shouldn't look at this, and to actually say, hey, there's a way to look at this in a right way, in the right setting, that actually sees this book as it is, which is a true and important work, and that ultimately I think is a gift for us to really reckon with these sort of things. So I do find it ironic, but also providential at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's good. Because I was just like, dang, it's crazy. Like some of the books like that he's referencing, like may not be able to be read in schools, like in some states or some counties,
right.
Or some school districts. So I just found that like super interesting that like this book is out now and it gives like, you know what I'm saying, like a different perspective on it. So that's just, to me, that's just dope. Go ahead. Were you about to say something?
Yeah, and I would say that's part of my hope with the book, that it would be a guide. You read some of these books, on some of these novels on their own, like Beloved, to go back to that as an example. I mean, it's a hard book in terms of the content, but also in terms of the form. Like, it reminds me a little bit. It's not an exact parallel, but like some Kendrick Lamar albums where you're sort of like, hey, there's a narrative that's happening here. I'm totally not sure exactly what's going on. it just seems really brutal. And I wanted my book to be able to be a guide to people who had read some of these novels before, but also obviously for people who had not read them before, and that I could sort of come alongside and kind of give them tracks on which to read and to think about literature that really matters, but on its own, people might sort of shy away for a variety of reasons. And rather than shy away, actually enter into the gift and hope of these works, doing so hopefully with a trusted guide, and not having to venture in on their own.
Yeah. In your book, like every chapter is devoted to a book, a specific book that you kind of like draw parallels to and whatnot. So is this kind of like, and I've read the book, but like, is this kind of like a Marvel thing where you got to like read the book before you can read your book, or is it kind of like, or is it more like the earlier Marvel movies where it's helpful to read the books, but you don't have to necessarily read it prior to?
Yeah, I think it can work in a couple of different ways. I think for in an ideal world, people know the book and then they could read my chapter. You have a deeper sort of engagement, but at the same time, I wanted to write it in a way in which those who had not read these works could read the chapter and sort of see what I'm talking about, follow the story. And the books are so rich and so powerful that they reward reading even if you already know what's going to happen. And in fact, if you know what's going to happen, you can actually pay deeper attention to the movement, to the themes, to the tone, etc. So I think it works in either way. At least that was my intention. And I think probably the best way to read my book would be to read the books, and then discuss it with others. I think it's a communal book. Like my book is a book about books, which also means it's a book that should be enjoyed with others. Just as I'm commenting on these books, I think it's reading my book makes the most sense if you can have a space to discuss some of the things that you're thinking about and responding to. It's a book club book.
Yeah, for sure. And like, even as somebody who has like a sociology minor and whatnot, I can easily see this book being read in like a sociology of religion course at like a secular university. Like I could easily see that. So like I say that to just like kind of agree with what you said. And also at the end of the book, I'm pretty sure there's a section that has discussion questions at the end of each chapter. So that's also super fruitful and super helpful in ways to just engage in the conversation communally. Now, in chapter 1 of the book, you talked about, again, reading theologically versus reading with empathy. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I think reading with empathy is important. And I think that's something that's commonly spoken about, which is good. And essentially that idea is, when you read a story, it's putting yourself in another's shoes. It's being able to connect with their experience as though it were your own. And that empathetic impulse is part of the power of story, part of the power of literature. I mean, part of the power of film as well, but especially literature. And so it's sort of when you're reading a novel, you can say, "Hey, this is giving me insight into this person's experience," and you can empathize and relate. And it's a way in which you can begin to kind of love your neighbor because you can see from their perspective a little bit. I think that's good and important. There's actually some interesting research, though, about, I think there's a novel called The Dark Side of Empathy. I can't remember the scholar or person who wrote it. There's some interesting research in terms of why sometimes empathy can be manipulated for unrighteous purposes. So I think it's important to recognize that. But in the case of my book, I'm trying to say empathy is good, but it's not ultimate. I think what's higher than empathy is reading theologically, which would be not only reading to sort of understand another's perspective, but to understand that person's perspective and experience in light of God's story. So, for example, Native Son, the main character, a novel by Richard Wright, a really difficult, and sort of a brutal, grimy kind of novel, an important one. The main character is named Bigger Thomas, and he grows up impoverished in Chicago, kind of back against the wall, pre-civil rights era. And I think reading empathetically, rather, would sort of be reading and kind of like feeling what Bigger has felt, and sort of, wondering what that would be like and kind of entering into that experience. Reading theologically would do that, but then it would do more. It would also say, okay, what does God's story have to say about Bigger's experience? It wouldn't stop at, I can feel and relate to what Bigger went through. It would extend further, kind of like climbing up a higher rung of a ladder to actually say, okay, I'm not just going to stop at empathy, which is me and Bigger, but actually like, what does God's truth have to say to people who are in positions, they're back against the wall, like Bigger Thomas? And then how am I supposed to relate to a world in which these sort of stories actually happen? And that's and what does God call me to? What does this teach me about the world, about God, and how I'm supposed to engage? So it's sort of
Yeah.
going up higher on the ladder rung of thinking comprehensively, in my view.
Yeah. No, that's good. All right, so let's focus on three chapters. Let's try to briefly focus on three
Okay.
chapters. Those three chapters being the image of God, where you read from Invisible Man, Justice, the man who lived underground, Hope, for my people. Let's try to focus on those
Okay.
three chapters as best as we can, and it's gonna be concise. I'm not gonna lie to you, but we're gonna give it a shot.
Let's do it.
All right, so Invisible Man. Why did you choose that book? What was it about that book that stood out to you to the point where you want to write a chapter not only about the Invisible Man, but about the Invisible Man in relation to the image of God?
Yeah, so Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison came out in 1952. It's one of the best novels of the 20th century, not just American novels or African American novels, just novels, period. It's a masterpiece. And it tells the story of sort of an everyday black person trying to find his place in the world, trying to be seen, trying to find his place of dignity. And everywhere he turns, he's used as a pawn. And he wonders, what will it take for society to see me? It's as relevant at the time of his publication as it is today. So because it's one of the best novels of the 20th century, that was really a no-brainer. And I think it answers a question that we're still asking. What does it take for us to see one another? What does it take for society to see us? And sight is really important. Not just in a generic way, but in terms of living faithfully unto God. We're told in 1 John that we can't say that we love God whom we can't see when we hate our brothers and sisters who we do see. Jesus tells us if our eyes cause us to sin, we should pluck them out, right? Speaking metaphorically, but also talking about the importance of sight and loving our neighbors. And so to me, Invisible Man is a really potent and important classic work that teaches us what it means to see and to recognize the God-given dignity of all people, and then to engage with them on the level of what's really true about them, which is their image bearing. So that was the easiest one to know to include, one of my favorites and a total classic.
Yeah, and I think the line that stood out to me the most from that chapter was, and it's talking about the main character, and it says, "With no one willing to affirm the reflection of God in him, Invisible takes the priestly duty upon himself." And I just think that's so beautifully written. Like, he takes that priestly duty upon himself. Talk to me about that one sentence.
Yeah.
And just kind of like in relation to everything.
Yeah. Thanks for pulling that out. So there's this point in the story where Invisible, the protagonist, he doesn't have a name, but that's kind of what, just call him Invisible. He goes from kind of like domain to domain trying to find dignity. So education, activism, kind of radical politics, work, employment, all these sorts of things. And no one recognizes his dignity. They all try to use him and use his gifts, right? Every place that he goes. And so in this portion of the novel, he stands in front of a mirror and he holds sort of like this achievement that he has in the form of letters, and he looks upon himself and sort of like tries to smile and tries to reflect himself, his own dignity back upon himself, because nobody else has looked at him that way. And I think that's connected to number 6 in the sort of idea that like God blesses us, like God puts a dignity upon us that others hopefully recognize. Not that we're perfect, but that we're blessed because we're made in God's image. Invisible doesn't receive that, so he tries in front of this mirror to sort of bestow that upon himself, and it ultimately kind of falls short because he's made for more, not just to feel his own dignity, but for others to see it and respond to it as well. And I think we can relate to that. The places where we try to compensate for a lack of dignity given to us through achievement, and that's a false theological truth. We don't have to achieve dignity. It's something that we're given because God is the one who has made all of us.
Yeah, and that was just such a good chapter. And I think that one point it says the problem isn't necessarily like black plight, but white sight. And those may not be the exact words, or the problem's not black lives, but white sight. Talk to me a little bit about that, and that's kind of the conclusion that Invisible Man comes to.
Yeah, so Invisible goes through this journey. The way the novel is structured is we know kind of how things end. We know that Invisible at some point is going through his life unaware of how people see him, unaware as to why people see him as invisible. And then we know the whole novel that there's coming this moment of epiphany. Like the pin is going to drop and he's going to realize, wow, the problem isn't so much me, it's actually how others see me. And that moment comes when he sort of hits this wall in his activism. He tries to organize the funeral for a black man who's killed unjustly, and his sort of political supervisor in his brotherhood organization says, like, "What do you think you're doing? How dare you do this?" And without ruining everything, a sort of glass eye pops out, and Invisible realizes, like, wow, these people just don't really see who I am. And what he realizes there is what he tells us on the first page, is that the fault is not so much him, but it's their inner eyes, the inner eyes of society. And I think when you draw out the lesson from the novel, it's this reality that sometimes no matter what someone does, people will just refuse to see their dignity. And I think theologically, it's the recognition that in a world full of sin and death and injustice, no matter how much you achieve, no matter how much good you do, no matter how many degrees you get, people may not see you as worthy of the dignity that God has given to you. And that doesn't mean that the fault is in you, but the fault may be in them. So you need to know who you belong to and where your dignity comes from, and that it's not attached to how you're seen or how you achieve, but it's a gift given to you by your Creator and your Redeemer. And so I think that's a really critical lesson. And then obviously that drills down and applies to so many conversations we've had around racial justice over the last 5, 6, 7 years. That the fault is not. Black people don't need to become respectable in order to be dignified. We need to be respected as all people are to be respected, because we've been made by God. We're image bearers. We don't have to be smart. Yeah. We don't have to be culture, whatever. All these things that people actually are. We don't have to be that to receive dignity. We're the image of God because we're human beings.
That's good. All right, let's go to Justice, the Justice chapter, The Man Who Lived Underground. Why that book? And just talk to us a little bit about that book, and give like those who don't know much about that book a quick synopsis of that book.
Yeah, so The Man Who Lived Underground, this is a novel by Richard Wright. So Richard Wright has 2 novels that I cover in the book. This one is probably, if people want to read one of them, this might be an easier way in. It's a shorter novel, and it moves with the pace of a thriller. It's about similar to Invisible, and it pairs well with Invisible Man. It's about an everyday black man named Fred Daniels who works, and he is trying to achieve, right? He works his job. He's a member at White Rock Baptist Church, and then wrong place, wrong time. He gets caught up by the police and is assumed as guilty for a murder, and then he flees to the underground after being brutalized by the police. And in this novel, he is basically pondering the question, what do I do in a world that is not just? Is there anything that I can do? And he ponders that from the underground, underneath society. He has to be outside of the world to sort of try to find an answer to this question. This is a novel that was actually released in 2021, even though it initially came out as a short story about 4 decades earlier. They found Richard Wright's notes and realized it wasn't just a short story. It was actually a novella, almost a short novel. So a lot of the story is fresh. It just came out as they discovered his notes. And so for that reason, I really wanted to include it. And I think it's a novel that the way it engages with questions of justice, it's not so much just about police brutality. It's really about how do we use the things in the world to create a world where people are dignified and not exploited. So when he's underground, he sort of plays with money. He plays with jewels. He plays with a typewriter. All of these kind of tools and representations of powerful items and aspects of society, and he plays with them kind of outside of their context, and really kind of questions like, okay, what is the purpose of money? What is the purpose of means? What is the purpose of narrative and storytelling? And how are these things often corrupted for the sake of injustice rather than used for the sake of righteousness? So it's a pretty thrilling story. It is a bleak novel, but I think in its bleakness, it gives a real diagnosis to the reality of what the world is actually really like much of the time.
Yeah, and one thing that stood out to me from this chapter was the phrase "docile religion." Docile religion. I think it came up at least 3 times in that chapter. Honestly, I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, as a basketball head, it reminded me of a Kyrie Irving. It was either a Kyrie Irving interview or a Kyrie Irving Instagram live, which is kind of the same thing. His IG lives is just him interviewing himself. But In that, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that happens for Fred Daniels, a protagonist, is as he gets kind of accosted by these unrighteous police officers, he thinks to himself, well, if they only knew that I was a member of White Rock Baptist Church, they won't mess with me. If they only knew I worked for Mrs. So and So, then they won't mess with me. All these sort of things. So he has this real naive understanding of the world, and it's almost exaggerated in the story, honestly. But I think Wright is trying to make this point, and if there is a fault to some of his writing, it's that he is so ideological. He tries to make these points that sometimes overshadow the story. But the point I think is still important, where Fred Daniels has this docile view of religion where it's sort of like, well, if you're good and faithful, then nothing bad will happen to you, almost. And then when he's in the underground, he begins to question that. So he hears the church songs, right? And he hears the church songs that are included in the novel. He hears the congregation singing the song, "Jesus, take me up to your blessed home above, wrap me in the bosom of thy love." And so he has just experienced that belonging to a church doesn't save him from injustice. And then he hears them singing this song, and he's sort of torn. The novel describes him leaning in and gravitating towards this song, but then also being repulsed by it. This sort of sense that, hey, this isn't enough to survive in a world of evil and brutality. There's got to be a message that not only points heavenward, but also gives me wisdom for life on earth, for injustice on earth. Not just I need to long for the future, but help connect that longing for the future into resilience and survival right now. And Wright is kind of writing this novel because he sees religion as unable to make that connection, unable to give people power when their back is against the wall. So in the chapter, I also try to engage with Howard Thurman, who talks about the hope of Jesus for the disinherited. And and that's the docile religion. The religion that Fred Daniels knows is docile. The only hope that it gives is this reality of like one day it will get better, but it doesn't connect that into the now, at least the way Wright conceives it. And so the Bible obviously offers us much more than that, but we have to connect those threads and bring those out and make those prominent. And that's something that Fred Daniels doesn't experience. So that's one of the tensions at the heart of the novel.
Yeah, and you talk about hope, so let's go ahead and get into the last chapter, the chapter of Hope for My People by Margaret Walker. And I'm not going to lie, like, I haven't read it, but it gives me very much so, like, we going to be all right vibes. Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I thought it was important to sort of end the novel with hope, not because it's sort of trite and it feels like, hey, let's just end on a good note. But I think one of the aspects of hope that's overlooked is that hope is only necessary if things are really bad. You don't need hope when things are good. You need hope when things are difficult. And because of that, I think hope by nature has an honest quality to it. And I think this poem by Margaret Walker is honest, it's hopeful, and it's truthful. Not only that, it's a personal favorite, and I think it has been a communal favorite for the Black community. It's sort of I talk about it as kind of like belonging to a communal public domain. It's a poem that's for our people, but has also been loved by this people. And one of the things that's powerful about the poem, and I only realized this as I was writing the chapter, is that it actually captures a lot of the threads and themes that are discussed in the other novels and works that I include in the book. And so it sort of ties everything together. And the reason it does that is the poem sort of stanza by stanza is almost like a camera taking this panoramic view of Black experience in America. And so it goes from Chicago to Alabama to people in taverns and clubs to people in the schoolyard. It covers kind of every spectrum of life, and it's honest. It's honest about shortcomings. It's honest about our triumphs. It's honest about our trials, our failures. It's honest about racism. It's honest about all of these things. And then it takes this turn at the end towards hope that almost feels like, well, how can things really be hopeful? And I think it shows the nature of hope, that hope has to be honest and historical. But then also hope has to come from outside of us. And the way that the poem speaks about hope is kind of this calling forth, let a new world arise for all Adams and Eves. A hope that is for our people, but also for all people. And all of these connective threads lead us into the hope that is ours in Christ, right? A hope that is given to us through the gospel, that Jesus isn't just redeeming one people, but bringing a redemption for the peoples of all tribes, nations, and tongues. And it's not just one that's detached from lived experience, experience, but actually transforms us in the now. So to me, it has so many deep resonance with New Testament hope. And it's an important last word because the way that she calls forth hope also includes activity and action. Not just, hey, let's hope things get better, but because of this hope, there's new work to be done in light of the pain that we've been through. And I think that's a fitting word, not just for Black experience, but in a real way for a universal human experience as well.
Yeah. One of our biggest YouTube video that we've ever done was on Hebrew Israelites, or Black Hebrew Israelites, and man, that is a talkative group in the comment section. Let me tell you that much. But we did this. And in this chapter, what stood out to me, like in relation to like some of the things they were saying, was in Jesus we gain a diverse people without the obliteration of our ethnic identity, which is now purified and intensified by the love and spirit of Christ. Talk to me about that real quick.
Yeah, so one of the connections I draw in the chapter is that Margaret Walker's For My People poem reminds me and has, I think, some thematic connections to the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 9 and also his writing in Galatians, specifically chapter 3, verse 28. In Romans 9, Paul begins to talk about longing for his kinsmen according to the flesh. It's not quite the same parallel as the way we talk about ethnic groups, but it's loosely approximate. And so he longs for his people to know Christ, and it's interesting because his realization that Jesus is the Christ, is Lord and Savior, God in the flesh. It doesn't obliterate what we would consider his ethnic identity. It actually intensifies it and purifies it, and also expands it. Now Gentiles, whom he would have seen in a particular way, sort of shunning them in a sense, now they're called in. And while they're called in, the people that he belongs to, he still belongs to them. But now he belongs to them with a new longing. He wants them to know the Savior he has come to know as well. And I think it's an important parallel when we connect it with Galatians 3:28, when he says, in Christ Jesus there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, but we're one in Christ. And so it's coming to Jesus is not the obliteration of our ethnic identity, as I write. It's this sort of intensification and this expansion of who our people is. So I think that's really important where we think about, a person who may have Puerto Rican or descent or heritage. For them to come to know Jesus doesn't mean that their cultural identity as a Puerto Rican, their ethnic identity is now obliterated and replaced with this kind of generic Christian identity. It's that they become a Christian who is also now sanctified in their ethnic identity while loving their people and then gaining a whole new people, the church, right? And so and this is the glory that comes in redemption, is that all of the beauty of our cultural heritage comes together in the family of God. Certainly there's broken aspects of our cultural heritage that needs to be redeemed and purified, but there's beauty that's brought in. And so we long for our people, we belong to those people, while we also belong to a new people, the church. And I think that's just a really important dynamic that also shows the beauty of God's redemption, the beauty of God's creation.
No, that's good. That's good. Well, I mean, my last question about the book is actually at the very end of the book. What is Aldermer Cat?
Oh man, that's hilarious. You're a close reader. Man, so there was one time, this is a special story, I'll tell this. So I think I was speaking at a church in Texas, Dallas area, where my kids, our whole family took the trip. We're all in one hotel room. And my kids, my boys, my daughter wasn't born. My boys, I want to say, were probably like 3 and 5, and so they were just going crazy and would not go to sleep. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna tell you guys a story. And I made up this character named Aldermer Cat, which is basically like I don't know, like a cat Han Solo, kind of like a space dude, like just just being a boss in space, locking up bad guys or whatever. So I came up with this story, and then it turned into a bedtime routine with different kind of stories. And then eventually for I think it was for my oldest son, or for both of them, for Christmas, I actually wrote a novel for this character, and then just got it like self-published and put it together and read it to them. So they may have moved on from that story, but after all this time writing this book, I promised them that I'd get back to writing the stories that they like. So that's Aldermer Cat.
Now, that's what's up.
Yeah, man.
What's up. All right, I really enjoyed the book. But before we get you out of here, I need to know what you're listening to. And I want to say that, also saying that I know you've listened to Kendrick Lamar's album. So talk to me about that, and then tell me what else you're listening to.
Yeah, so the Kendrick album, yeah, so I wrote a piece on it for Think Christian. If you go to thinkchristian.net or maybe in the show notes, it's called Kendrick Lamar and Wounded Healers. Yeah, you know, he's had a really interesting evolution if you're just looking on the sort of religious side of things, from sort of a more explicit kind of conversation with Christianity to kind of a Hebrew Israelite kind of dynamic on his album Damn, and then now into a more spiritualist kind of melded with Christianity, kind of a syncretist view with some of the Eckhart Tolle audio clips on his most recent album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. I think musically, I mean, he as a rapper, obviously he's one of the best. He's hard to top. Yeah, I don't know. There's some songs I really enjoy. There's some songs, to me, the album as a whole feels like a good movie that's hard to watch, where there's certain movies where I find I'll watch them one time and I never need to watch it again. That was a great movie. Yeah. Don't need to see it again. I think a lot of his album is a little bit like that. So I think it has artistic greatness. I wonder about its sort of replay value outside of particular songs. So I wonder about that. And then I also wonder about his real sense of trying to like be an act of a person of healing to his listeners. He seems very interested in trying to help his people, his community, his listeners process healing and trauma, and I commend that. I just wonder, I wonder if his solution and proposal towards that is really can really live up to what he hopes for. I don't think it quite can, but starting the conversation I think is good. So I listened to a little bit of that, just particular songs, and then I love Lupe Fiasco. He has an album that's going to come out I think in 2 days called Drill Music in Zion, I think is what it's called. There's a couple singles out.
Is it a drill album?
I'm guessing based on the title. There's only one single out. I mean, I think he's probably the most talented rapper that our world has known. That doesn't mean he makes the best songs or the best albums, but in terms of talent, I think he's hard to top. Maybe come on a different podcast episode, we could argue about that.
Yeah.
And then I also like Taylor Gray and Wes Pendleton have an album called or a group called Middle Clash, and I think they had an album that came out I want to say last week, and I've been slow. I just got around to listening to a little bit of it today, and I've really enjoyed it. You can't get it on streaming. You can only buy it on Bandcamp. Taylor Gray is also a pastor in Ohio, is a tremendous rapper as well. So those would be the two things I've been listening to. I would say the most.
Yeah, Taylor Gray. Speaking of which, we've had Philip Holmes on the podcast, and
yes,
he actually does a podcast with Philip Holmes.
Malcolm X.
And Philip Holmes talked about that. Yeah, Philip Holmes talked about that on the podcast. Well, that podcast is out now, so y'all need to check that out. It is. It won't be in the show notes. Not gonna lie to you, not putting it there. But you can find it. I promise you can. But as far as your Think Christian article, that will be in the show notes.
All right, cool.
Have you listened to Drake's album?
I skimmed through it, and then I said, not for me. I mean, I think his last album, I think he knew it was a dud, and so he came with something different. Drake is interesting. I think, again, incredibly talented. I find his music mostly disappointing because he's been around, and I'm looking for him to make some sort of turn into a different type of content and a different type of reflection that he's obviously incredibly gifted, really a great year, more than capable of, but maybe is not interested in. So until that happens, I mean, it's just kind of in the not for me genre.
Yeah, and Ryan is not here today, but we all know that Ryan is a huge Drake fan, and Ryan has made the public statement. So I can say this, Ryan, you said it on social media, so it's fair game. Ryan made the public statement that he no longer considers Drake the light-skinned legend. That title has been given to Steph Curry. So
wow, big deal.
Just throwing it out there. It was not for me either. That Drake album. So I 100% feel that.
Yeah.
I know you're not active. I know you're not really active on social media, but how can one get your book?
Yeah, you can get my book on Amazon. You can get it pretty much anywhere where books are sold. Your Barnes & Noble may have a copy or two, but yeah, you can pick it up on Amazon. That's probably the easiest place. Grab it. If you enjoy it, leave a review. Reviews really matter, especially for first-time authors, as we said, without a huge platform. Helps a book be visible for others. So Amazon be your place. Barnes & Noble. Anywhere books are sold, you can track it down. So if you read it and enjoy it, leave a review. Reach out to me. I'd love to hear chapters that are impacting people, questions you have, ways that the book is meaningful to you. If so, would love to hear that.
And how can they reach out to you?
Reach out to me on Twitter. Just my first and last name on Twitter. Same on Instagram. I'm not super active on there, but at least once a week I pop in. So if you say something, drop a note. I'll see it and would love to engage.
Cool. Hey, the book was great. I enjoyed it. I really did enjoy reading it. It was a harder read than I thought it was gonna be. I'm not gonna lie. But it was a good read. It was a good read. You about to say something?
Yeah, you can't breeze through it quick. It's pretty dense. And it's not long, but it is dense. So you kind of got to take a bit at a time.
Yeah. Well, shoot, we appreciate you. For our podcast listeners, this episode will also be on YouTube. So follow us on YouTube, subscribe to us. We would greatly appreciate that. I know we've been AWOL for a little minute, but we are back for today, and we'll be out again for another month and a half. But for today, we are back, and this is the season finale, and I'm glad to have you on the pod for the season finale. Hey, y'all, make sure y'all leave us 5-star reviews. Make sure you do that on Spotify as well, as you can do that now. And also just stay tuned with us. Stay tuned. Ryan will be back soon. We both been really busy, but I'm glad we were able to get this in as the season finale. I don't know why I keep saying finale. Finale. There is nobody else I'd rather have for the season finale, so we really do appreciate you, Claude.
Man, good to be with you, Darius. Appreciate the love, and enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yep. I'm Darius Watkins, and Ryan Thomas is not here, but this is Unconformed Podcast, and we out.